For any runner that is ready to embrace heart rate training, one of the key pieces of the puzzle early on, and quite frankly throughout the process, is making sure that you're training at the appropriate level of intensity for you, aka determining what heart rate is good, what heart rate's too high, where do you maybe want to push a little harder. And the fact of the matter is, there is no universal, one-size-fits-all method of determining what heart rate is the right heart rate to be training at in every situation. In today's video, we're going to talk about 3 ways to figure out what heart rate zone is the right zone for you now that you've decided to make heart rate training the central tenet of how you train going forward. When you break it all down, quite frankly, the key to heart rate training is making sure that you're doing the bulk of your training in the aerobic training zone, building up your aerobic system. And the key to doing so is making sure that you're working out at a moderate level of intensity, typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 70-75% of your maximum heart rate. There are pretty much 3 ways to figure out your maximum heart rate, each of which have their own pros and cons. The first option is to go to a physiology lab, get on a treadmill, get wired up, and do an aerobic stress test. This is, without a doubt, the best way to determine your maximum heart rate. However, it can be a little bit expensive, and potentially a bit expensive. And it's also not always the most practical in that you have to reserve time in a physiology lab. You have to live close enough to a physiology lab to actually have the opportunity to reserve time in a physiology lab, and quite clearly that doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. The next rung down on kind of the tier of best options available would be to do an actual fitness test on your own. Now, you're going to want to make sure you've got your heart rate strap going because, as we all know, that is the most accurate way to get a heart rate reading when training. And you're going to set out to do some pretty maximum efforts. Think hard 5K, multiple hill repeats, something where you're really pushing hard for an extended period of time, and that's going to help you determine about what your maximum heart rate might be. The downside with these fitness tests is that, quite frankly, it's hard to push yourself to that maximum level, and so maybe what you think is your maximum might not actually be your maximum, so you do have a little bit of margin for error there. Also, when you're pushing hard for these tests, like it hurts. Like you're hammering, sprinting, maximum effort, not the most pleasant experience, though potentially a fairly accurate representation of what your true maximum heart rate could be. Last but not least on the scale of ways to determine your maximum heart rate is some good old standard mathematics. There's formulas out there, multiple formulas actually, that all come pretty close, some marginally better than others, that will help you determine what your maximum heart rate is based on your age and plugging it into a formula, perhaps using your gender as well. Some formulas yes, some formulas no, but one way or the other, it'll give you an idea of what your one-size-fits-all maximum heart rate might be. And then once you've determined your maximum heart rate, no matter which method you use, you then multiply that by 0.75, which would be 75%, to determine kind of what your upper limit of your aerobic heart rate would be. Because again, the key with heart rate training is to stay in that aerobic training zone for pretty much every single workout.
But Diz, what about the math formula you talk about all the time?
Ah, yes, the good old math number. Something that I've talked about at least a few times, which math actually stands for maximum aerobic functioning, which basically just says that at or below this heart rate, you're training in an aerobic zone. The formula for this one, really simple. 180 minus your age gives you your maximum aerobic heart rate. Now, how does that compare to using some of the other general formulas out there that also take your age into consideration? Well, actually, they compare pretty favorably, not coincidentally. And that's why the math method is actually my preferred method, because it's the easiest, it's the simplest, it's basically foolproof, which, I don't know, is that a safe assumption in 2022? Got calculators, right? Right. So let's get out of the theoretical and look at some hard numbers. Right now, as of recording this video, I am 40 years old, which makes the math really easy, kind of no matter which formula I use. So with the math formula, to determine my maximum aerobic heart rate at which I need to continue to train under to build my aerobic fitness, it's simply 180 minus 40, which is my age, 140 beats per minute. As long as I'm staying below 140 beats per minute, I'm good to go. But what about if you use a little bit of a fancier formula? Like I said earlier, there are a few variations of the formula, but the formula that's fairly widely considered to be the most accurate for most athletes is to start with 208 and then subtract the product of, which just means to multiply these two numbers together first before subtracting it from 208, 0.7 times your age. So for me, at 40 years old, that means that my maximum heart rate, according to this formula, is 180 beats per minute. But that's my max heart rate, not my max aerobic heart rate, which is an important thing to always keep in mind when you're doing any of these tests. Make sure you know, are you calculating for your max heart rate or your max aerobic heart rate? So then I take 180 beats per minute, multiply that by 0.75, which would be 75% of that heart rate, and I come up with a number of 135 beats per minute. So in that situation, which number should you use? Well, some would say always go with the lower number. Quite frankly, it's up to you, and if they're close enough, they're probably close enough. Quite frankly, I never quite get to 140 beats per minute anyway, so it kind of comes out in the wash. But if you have a big disparity between numbers, I would encourage you to go with the lower number, simply because you're erring on the side of caution when figuring out what your upper limit of aerobic training should be. What about for somebody who's a little bit older? Let's use 65 as an example, because quite frankly, when you get into your 60s with the math formula, it can get pretty tough to maintain much running at all, because 180 minus 65 means that you need to keep your heart rate while training below 115 beats per minute. Now, I don't know about you, but that's hard to do. My heart rate is not below 115 very often at all. But what if we looked at the other formula, taking 208 minus the product of 0.7 times 65? Well, in that case, we would work out, when we do the math and we multiply by 75%, to actually have a heart rate target of 122. Still low, but those extra 7 beats can actually make a pretty big difference in helping you to continue to be able to run more and not have to walk as often if your heart rate starts to creep up a little bit. So then let's cut to the chase. What is the best way to figure out the heart rate zones that you should be in if you're trying to train aerobically, AKA if you're buying into heart rate training? Quite frankly, I don't know that there is a best way. I think that for most folks, the simple method is the best method. And it's also the method I use, so maybe there's some bias here. I don't know, you be the judge of that. But keeping it simple, keeping the math as simple as possible, 180 minus your age makes it pretty easy. Once you figure that out, every year you get a year older, you bump your number down one as well. Bada boom, bada bam. Pretty easy to do, but quite frankly, it doesn't work for everybody. If your heart rate is naturally a little bit higher, then you might really struggle to keep your heart rate under that 180 minus your age number, or the number that you get when using another formula that utilizes your age and brings your age into the equation. In that case, it might be worth doing either the lab stress test or just strapping on your heart rate monitor and heading out for a good hard effort, good hard 5K, and doing a good hard fitness test that way to help determine what your actual working heart rate is. And then once you get that result and you take the formula out, you might find that your aerobic training zone is actually a little bit higher than what you find when you do the formula. Be careful though, because if you do the test and find that the zone is actually a bit lower than what the formula says, don't just disregard the test and stick with the higher number from the generic formula. No. If you do the fitness test, use the results from the fitness test no matter what, because those are going to be less one size fits all than the formula, kind of by definition. So there you go. Figuring out your heart rate training zone isn't super complicated, but it might take a little bit of work, a little bit of trial and effort. And if you find yourself really struggling to keep your heart rate in your aerobic zone, please be patient. Progress with heart rate training takes a while, but if you stick to it, if you keep your heart rate in the appropriate zone more often than not in your training over the coming weeks and months, you'll start to find that you're able to run more with a lower heart rate, and that is the key to progress with heart rate training.